Welcome back, folks, to day number 17 of the Bible in 365. Today we're taking a look at Genesis chapter 48, verse 8, all the way through the end of the chapter. And then we are also taking a look at Exodus chapter 1. We got a lot to talk about, folks, so let's get started. All right, folks, so yesterday our conversation ended right in the middle of the story. We found out that Jacob is on his deathbed, and so Joseph and his two sons journey to see the dying Jacob. Our story picks up today, and we see that Joseph is blessed by his father Jacob, as well as Joseph's two sons, and this becomes a little bit of a point of contention between Joseph and his father, because his father Jacob blesses both of Joseph's sons, but says that the younger will be greater than the older. And this upsets Joseph. But Jacob says that's the reality of what will come to pass. So at this, he blesses both Joseph and his sons and says that he is about to die. So our story continues in Genesis chapter 49. Here we see that Jacob gathers all of his sons to him and blesses each one of them. Now, some of their blessings seem a little more like curses. For instance, take Reuben. When Israel or Jacob blesses him, it says that you will face turbulent waters and you will no longer excel because you defiled my bed. And so as you're reading through these blessings, just pay attention to those little nuances that not all of the sons are truly blessed. Some are, in fact, more or less cursed. Now, at the end of the chapter, in verses 29 through 33, we see it's at this point in time that Jacob passes away. He's getting ready to die, and he says once again to his sons, in particular to Joseph, hey, bury me with my ancestors. Bury me in the cave that Abraham bought in the land of Machpelah near Canaan. When he bought the cave and the land, Abraham and Sarah are buried there, as well as Isaac and Rebecca, and that's where I buried Leah, and I want my bones to be buried there as well. Don't bury them here. And so that is the final instructions that are left. It's kind of the dying words of Jacob, and then the chapter tells us that he, in fact, breathes his last and was gathered to his people. So moving on, chapter 50 tells us all about the grieving process. It tells us that right upon the death of Jacob, Joseph mourns and grieves the loss of his father. It tells us that the Egyptian physicians took 40 days for the embalming process. It tells us that it was customary for the Egyptians to mourn for 70 days. And so the Egyptians gather with Joseph and mourn for 70 days the loss of Jacob. At this point in time, Joseph goes before the Pharaoh and says, if I found any favor in your sight, please let me go fulfill this promise that I made to my dad. His last request was to be buried with his ancestors in the land of Canaan. So please allow me to go. And Pharaoh says, yes, we will mourn with you and we will go with you. And so Pharaoh's household, the courts, the officials accompanied Joseph and his brothers, all except for the children, and they went down to the land of Canaan. When they reached the Jordan River, they stopped there and they mourned for another 7 days before they took the body to Machpelah to be buried there in the cave. And then upon that point in time, Joseph and those who went with him down to the land of Canaan, they returned to Egypt. So Jacob's death brought on a little bit of fear for Joseph's brothers. They believed now that their father is dead, their brother would act out in retribution and seek revenge for all the bad that they had brought on him. Joseph actually responds kindly and mercifully, and he weeps before them, and he says, what you intended for harm, God intended for good, and he saved many lives. So don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And so Joseph fulfilled that promise up until the point of his death. And it tells us that Joseph lived 110 years. He saw many children, many descendants, grandkids. And so upon Joseph's death, they embalm him and they bury him in a coffin there in Egypt. All right, folks, so we finished our first book. We finished Genesis, and we left off in the story there with Joseph's death, and we're moving forward to Exodus chapter 1. We know from historians and Jewish tradition that about 50 years have passed. The biblical text itself tells us that Joseph and all of his brothers have died off, an entire generation has died, that there's a new Pharaoh or a new king of Egypt, that the old one has died. So we do know that some time has passed. We know that in this time, the Israelites, which remember it started with 70 of them in the land, have multiplied and become exceedingly great, and they are now starting to pose a threat. It tells us in verse 9 of chapter 1, the Pharaoh says that the Israelites have become far too numerous, and we must deal shrewdly because if they continue to grow in population, they can join one of our enemies and they can overthrow us. So we need to be very, very careful. And so they put slave masters in charge and they implement forced labor and they make their lives bitter and harsh. But in the midst of this hard lives, they are still blessed. They still multiply exceedingly. And so it's at this point in time that the king of Egypt says to the Hebrew midwives, to Shiphrah and Puah, that when you're helping Hebrew women give birth, kill the boys that are born, but the little girls, they may live. But these Hebrew midwives feared the Lord, so they allowed the boys to live. Now, when their life was threatened and they said, hey, why are all these boys making it through? They said, well, you know, the Hebrew women are just exceedingly strong. And so they have their children, they give birth before we arrive. So there's nothing we can do. And so it's at this point in time that God grants them favor and they live. Now it tells us that because of this, the Pharaoh has to change his tactics. And at the end of chapter 1, it says that Pharaoh gives the order to all people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile River, that is. But let every girl live. And so it's here with this cryptic command from Pharaoh to kill all the baby boys that are reading ends for tonight. All right, folks. So we're going to continue exploring this story tomorrow as we take a look at Exodus chapter 2 to Exodus chapter 5, ending in verse 9. As always, folks, God bless.